Cord to the cloud. All right. All right, so today's topic, shadow. Personal favorite of mine. That's because the shadow never lies. That's why the shadow is a thing that that I like. The shadow always tells the truth, and that'll make sense by the end of this statement. The reason, well, I'll save that for the big reveal. Build a little bit why the shadow always lies. I'll construct it ahead of time. All right, so first of all, we're going to go with the beginning thing that we always do at the beginning of these lectures and talk about definitions. So I've only got 2 words to handle this time, and one of them is the. So I feel like I'm in pretty good shape for that. So you always want to open with a soft joke, by the way, just like a joke chub, as it were, like a joke slow dance chubby, not a full joke. You save those for when people are getting bored. But the shadow. So that was a concept that was written about by the psychologist Carl Jung, one of the, if not the first analytical psychologist. And so if anyone hasn't heard what analytical psychology is, I'm going to take a minute to explain that too, because that's important. So Carl Jung believed that there were rules to emotions that people follow without realizing. He was the original person to theorize that there was an underlying mathematical structure to human behavior that could be predicted and mapped ahead of time to a frightening degree of accuracy, the more one immerses themselves in it. And I can say from personal experience that if you combine the right perspectives with the right measurements, with the right observations, with a person who is not familiar with what you're talking about, you will get an accurate measurement from that person. That's all I'm saying. What you do with that measurement is infinite potential, because there's infinite ways to measure a thing. However, there are almost infinite ways to measure a thing uselessly or incompletely, or maybe, to be a little bit more generous, to measure it in a way that does not further the goal you have right now. So an awareness of whether your measurements will further your goal is what is required to make use of this information, which means first you need to have a deep understanding of goals in general, or at least the identification of a goal. A goal can be hypothetical. A goal can last for a second. A goal can last for 20 years. A goal for another person might be something they don't understand they're doing and think they're doing something else. For example, a person might say their goal is to get really strong at the gym. Their reason for getting really strong at the gym is they were bullied as a kid and they feel insecure. So really, they're going to the gym to feel less insecure. That is their goal. The strength is the rationalization. That's the heroic armor that goes over the exercise. A layer of metaphor is draped over that uncomfortable realization. It's a rebranding. Which one is true? They're both true. The person has a reason why that thing is important to them, and that reason is not false. The motivation behind that reason might not be fully understood, because a lot of people, you ask them, why do you want to do that? They tell you the same thing. I don't know. Or I never thought about it. Or fill in the blank. But I'll tell you what all of those things have in common, which is how you know when you've reached this point. They avoid the question without answering it. So that's how the shadow says hello. Shadow says hello when it doesn't want to acknowledge something exists. Because I'm getting ahead of myself. So the shadow, Carl Jung, his idea was that nothing exists as a one-dimensional construct within human beings. And I would say that's mostly true. There are ways to create one-dimensional constructs, and people do this all the time. But there's a difference between creating and imagining something and having the full picture of what's going on behind that process. So, for example, Carl Jung pretty much said that the shadow is the parts of yourself that you pretend don't exist. That's a short, overly simplified example. There's a book about the shadow. There's multiple books from him about the shadow. So I've given you the baby food definition that kind of is the catch-all, but it really doesn't, it catches everything relevant, but it doesn't catch everything specifically. And it gives no direction beyond that. There's no morality, there's no utility beyond recognizing that the core fundamental principle behind the shadow is it's the part of yourself that you're not aware of, or the part of yourself that you're ashamed of and don't acknowledge, or whatever, a lot of reasons again. But the core reason is you don't know about it. So that is why we did the lecture on unknown unknowns before we did the lecture about the shadow. Because the shadow is the definition of a personal unknown unknown, and it is complementary to all of your known knowns. Everything you know about yourself has a counterpart or a counter potential, which goes back to a different lecture where I talked about how to get more pieces of information than a single one. This is the superpositional perspective, meaning when you have a data point, you have a thing that is being measured with that data point, or thing that is being referred to. If you can identify that thing, you can then imagine the most far out extreme in one direction, the negative extreme. You can imagine the most positive extreme you can imagine. And then you have an external point of reference to measure where your data point falls on that external point of reference. So that was a different lecture. So if that's way too fast, I spent about 2 hours on it in a previous lecture. If the shadow was too sexy to resist, you find yourself getting lost in that concept. It's only a couple hours. I promise it's worth the investment. But so it's the 3 pieces of information thing. So number one, if you're going to understand the shadow beyond this amorphous concept of all the parts of myself that I pretend don't exist, that's where you need the math that we covered in the previous episode. First, you need a diagnostic tool, which is to recognize when interaction with the shadow is relevant or possible. So that's the, how do I know when I'm experiencing an unknown unknown? And we covered that. Your shadow and your subconscious are not synonymous, but they're very closely linked, okay? The shadow is not your unconscious mind, but your shadow has access to it. The shadow, and that's a different way of saying your shadow uses all of the information you won't. And if it doesn't do it on purpose, that's when you get some crazy side effects like unbalanced people. So first is you need to recognize when you're trapped inside an unknown and unknown, or when you're next to one. Trap might be a strong word. When you're in the presence of an unknown unknown, you will, you can use the tricks that we gave you in the last episode. You'll get cues. You'll be curious. You'll be angry. The point is you'll react. You will react emotionally by accident. That's the short answer for how you know you're experiencing an unknown unknown. You have an emotional reaction or some sort of reaction that you didn't plan for. It was a surprise. It came from inside you. It was not a choice you made. So now, because it came from inside you and it wasn't a choice that you made, you have a reaction, and then you have your mind, which then needs to react to that reaction, right? And that's what gets a lot of people caught. Oh man, that thing made me scared. How do you react to being scared? I run away. What about that thing? Well, I don't know, I was too scared. Or I was too angry. Or I love that person too much, so I'm not going to look at that. Or that doesn't matter. That's a big one. That's a really big one. But beyond more anything else is, I don't see why that matters. You may as well have a billboard with flashing neon signs that says, trapped inside an unknown, and I don't want to leave, when the go-to is, we can't explore this even hypothetically. The excuses are so weak. It would be a waste of time. How much of a waste of time? Compared to what? Compared to how long it takes you to tell me it would be a waste of time? Often that takes 5, 6, 7, or 8 times as long as exploring the thing would. So that isn't the real answer. That's where you go to motivations that are claimed versus motivations that are real by action. If it was because it wasn't worth the time to do, well, then you wouldn't spend any time on how much it isn't worth to do that thing. That's an even bigger waste of time. Less comes of that. At least you'd learn a new thing if you did the whatever that is a waste of time. So that's one just little secondhand trick there. If somebody doesn't want to talk about it because they don't see how it matters, they're inside an unknown. And that's when I mean the shadow never lies. Because people are not capable of acting like they know things they don't. That makes sense. If a person is completely oblivious to something, it would be perfectly reasonable to assume that they would act in a manner that is consistent with a person that doesn't know about the thing that they're not aware of. A great example is video games, okay? And this goes way back. One of the first, if not the first Nintendo game, NES, classic console out of Japan, had Mario Brothers 1, 8-bit side scroller, low tech, low graphics, pretty good gameplay for the technology at the time, actually a revolutionary step in the gaming industry, and Mario was top dog for quite a while. But when you talk about unknown unknowns in Mario, you have invisible blocks hidden. They have power-ups like extra lives, invincibility stars, coins, you name it, riches. But how do you get them? Well, you just got to bump into them first. But then, say you play the game again, or you have a conversation again, and you're following a similar path. You know, if you jump in that spot, you'll hit an extra block and get a power up every time, even though there's nothing there to indicate that it's true. It was invisible before, but you bumped into it. You learned enough about bumping into things to find out what you bumped into, and now you have it, and now you can find it easily. So when I talk about the language of the shadow, everything has a language. This is that language. First of all, is the language of unknown unknowns. So getting past the barrier of interacting with unknown unknowns is how you say hello to the shadow. So you have to be comfortable exploring parts of yourself and finding parts of yourself that you are not aware of on purpose, systematically, before the shadow will take you seriously. And here's a reason for that. You're blind to everything it does. It has complete power. It's operating with free will that you're not aware of, and it has access to your reactionary systems through the subconscious. Because guess what? If you don't know how to control your reactionary systems, the part of you that exists that you're not aware of will be in control of those reactionary systems. You can take that control back when you integrate that part of the shadow into yourself. So let's take a step back, because I'm talking about like there's two sorts of divisions inside a person. It almost makes it sound like a person has a split personality. Yes and no, but that's a different topic for a different day. The left hemisphere, the right hemisphere, and the gut brain that I've mentioned in one of my early lectures have been proven to have separate brain states, independent of one another. So our consciousness is the melding of all those communications. Like we're somehow trapped in the middle, and we get to evaluate all of these measurements and readings and reactions and responses and say, out of all this stuff I understand, this is how I react. So that's the first thing, is your shadow is you. It is a part of you that is just easily summed up by giving it a personality, because in many ways it has one, because it's part of you. So it has a personality in the same way that you have a personality, in the same way that it is in your body and you are in your body. So the first thing is, just because it's inside of you, just because you don't know about it, just because you'd rather know that it doesn't exist, doesn't mean that it's not intrinsically linked to you in an inseparable way. So that's the first hurdle to overcome, the disgust sensitivity. What's up?
Not specific to that, but I just realized what's been off so far. Like the big thorn in my side since close to the beginning.
Okay.
It's that the communities I roll with are shadow workers.
Okay.
Like everybody in that Heyoka clown group is a fan of shadow work. Whether they choose to practice it or not, they're not going to discourage any.
So what have you learned about shadow work?
The same that you're talking about as well. So young shadow is a psychological, and the shadow work that I'm referring to is more spiritual, but it comes from the exact same place. And one of my response memes that I use a lot is the one that I use, and that's the definition, that my best definition, and it all fits. It all completely fits. Like there was no reason to interrupt. The reason why I could express the thorn in my side is because there's no more thorn in my side. I now understand the confusion over the dissonance over perspectives and people was what I've been trying to figure out until now. So, and I figured you would appreciate.
Are you saying just now this shook loose? This is a very recent thing.
Well, the thing was, everything you were saying was correct.
The timing is important for me, so I'm trying to measure exactly when it happened.
Right before I raised my hand. So before,
okay,
so your second last point maybe, and we can always rewind the tape to find it.
No, that was fine. But it wasn't a week ago. It was immediate.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Okay. No. It was here. And
So what was resolved?
Well, I just realized that everything you're saying is true, but it seems to be from the standpoint that most people think the shadow to be negative. I didn't finish my my definition.
Sure.
Because my definition does have some negative.
Go ahead.
It's a common misconception that the shadow is home to the worst parts of ourselves. This is false. The shadow is actually home to the rejected parts of ourselves. And for this reason, the shadow is full of untapped potential and creativity.
Yeah.
So at the point where the journey of self-awareness begins, of spirituality for most people begins, things like that, that's when this shadow area or realm or concept becomes different, I suppose. Because it's now sought after.
It is not. It is not sought after. No, there's like a few guys in the world who really care about this. I'm one of them. Jordan Peterson is one of them. Carl Jung was one of them. There's a few people who kind of get it, who are mildly interested, but would rather stay away from the soul-crushing parts of what it means to go all the way to the bottom. Because you have to crush it before you can reform it. It's like Jell-O.
If you'd like, I know people who've studied it longer than you've been alive.
That'd be fun. I want to see if I got there faster then.
I mean, they're in the group. Like I said, no one in the group is from that perspective that it's not. So, no, man, like I said, nothing you said has been wrong. Everything fits from my perspective.
Let me run something by you, something interesting about engagement that you just triggered. This is a little off topic, but I think you'll find it interesting because engagement is a topic you told me you find interesting. I'm going to take a measurement right now and have you hold it. So let's measure engagement by stability over time. Okay? As one way to measure it. You could measure it as engagement, yes or no, in the moment, sure. Getting anybody to engage one time is one kind of measurement. Getting someone to engage and keeping them engaged long-term or indefinitely on some level there is a process that I use when I talk to people before I invite them into the Shepherd's Dojo. And it is a measurement process where it's more or less a measurement for tolerance to new ideas. And I combine that with how they handle having more power than someone, which I've talked about how to test, and how they handle having less power than someone, which I've talked about how to test, in very innocuous, innocent, and simple ways. So you can do no harm with these measurements, but how you use these measurements can prevent great harm, which is why I learned how to do them. So look at the dojo and ask how many people has Tom, and this can be rhetorical, how many people has Tom invited that have left the group? Just let that hang. I don't think it's been anybody in this group. I've had other groups where I was trying to learn how to make a stable group and they failed. But using these social algorithms that we've talked about and the shadow work and all of these other things that have been in all these lectures, there's an engagement algorithm that's in there, absolutely. And I'll have to maybe I can do a lecture about engagement. I could do one, I just didn't put it on my list. I could talk for an hour and a half about the psychology of engagement. We'll do that. I'll add that to my future roster, but I'm gonna get back on topic now so I can talk about it.
Yep, back to the show.
Yep. So, yeah, it's all the parts of you that you'd rather pretend don't exist. We talked about how to find it. We talked about how to say what's going on. More or less, if you want to say hello to your shadow, you need one question. So this is the magic bullet shadow question here. If you ask this question, you are trying to speak to your shadow 100% of the time. Why did I react that way? If there is no good answer, there's a part of yourself you don't understand. Because you did it. You did a thing successfully that is incredibly complex, both chemically, hormonally, thought-wise, conscious-wise, and physiologically wise. Every way that you can measure what you've done means you did it. You had that reaction. There was a reasoning where all of the information you had access to was sufficient to produce a response instead of nothing. So that's number one. A reaction happened. That needs to be important because it's true. Anything that's true can be important. And if a person has a reaction, they get to use that. I can say nothing else, but I can say I had a reaction because I had a reaction. It's an axiom. It's a truth. It's a one-dimensional truth. So you have a stable one-dimensional truth, which is the lecture on the nature of axioms. And we talked about how to build 1, 2, and 3-dimensional concepts using the point and going out from there. So I'm not going to reconstruct that. But the point is, you have a truth. I reacted. Now, if you did all of those amazing things that resulted in that reaction, and you have no idea how that happened, and you believe that there is a part of you that you pretend like it doesn't exist, then it makes sense, at least as a hypothesis to test, which later on turns out to be true, that the thing that you understand that you don't know why was coming from a part of you you'd rather pretend doesn't exist. And that can be confusing because of what you said. You made the differentiation, a very relevant differentiation in this case. The shadow is not a positive or negative thing. It is a blindness and sight thing. It is an awareness and lack of awareness thing. For example, a nice person who is very kind and gentle would be blind to the fact that one act of temporary, non-permanent violence could prevent a war. That person's about to push a button to launch nuclear missiles because he's lost his mind. I don't want to kill them with my service revolver, but I can walk up and knock them out from behind. And if that person abhors violence to such a degree that they can't even entertain that concept, the potential is lost to them, meaning they can't do a thing they don't know they can do, or they can't do a thing they've decided they can't do. So it is a self-limiting potential. And that goes back to that definition of the shadow. Shadow is untapped potential. So if you go back to a different episode, which is why this lecture was so late, combines many things, we're talking about power again, power potential. And I'll remind everyone that I'm using a neutral definition of potential, meaning if I have a gun, I can use it to kill Hitler and I can use it to kill babies. Not that I would do either, because Hitler's dead and I don't want to kill babies. But the point is, there is a potential that exists, or I could do it to a trick shooting rodeo. I could do that with a gun. I could entertain, or say that I didn't have a way to communicate, but I needed to warn somebody at a great distance. Well, nothing wakes people up like a bunch of gunshots. If that was my only option to get attention, maybe pop, 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 but at least get people looking around, whereas before they had their heads down. And if that was my only move, that is a potential. So all of that centered around the concept of guns. Guns are not good or bad. Guns have potential to move a small piece of metal at a high speed. That is all a gun is. The creativity of man does the rest. It's not magic. A slingshot is similar. So now we're talking about all of these untapped potentials. So the point is, you have untapped potential. That doesn't mean that you can't use it. That means you can't control it because you don't know it's there. But you have the potential at all times. So if you're put in a situation that you don't understand and there's a reaction that you react so strongly to that you can't understand your own reaction, well, now you are experiencing a potential that you can't control or identify. So guess what? You're just going along for the ride at that point. That's the shadow. I'll give an example. Now I'm going to start getting a little bit more specific. So I've got this picture up here, right? So Carl Jung, one of the other things that he did that was very useful was he mapped the human psyche into 12 dimensions. You could pick any 12 dimensions. Some people take this map and map it into subsections. I've seen those maps, they're good maps. The more detailed you make the map, the more specific it is. You could take a map like this and extend it all the way down to every person on the planet with enough separation. There's finite people, which means even if people have infinite potential, the finite nature of how many of us there are limits how that potential can present. We can only experience the potential of 7 billion human beings right now, or however many there are in the world. Everybody thinks at 9, we're going to start going back down. Oh my God, Duncan, what time? Let's see, I'm going to say, I'm going to be kind. I'm going to say there's 60 minutes left.
I'm going to go check the laundry. I'll be right back. I'm bringing the speaker in case you want to keep going.
Yeah, I will. So the archetypes. So we're talking about ways that people can categorize themselves. So we can look at these and we'll say the everyman, the caregiver, the creator. Some of these are cut off because images are stupid on Zoom and they don't show the whole image. So I'm gonna bring up my own image here, so at least I can see what the information is supposed to be. I don't have the chart memorized. There we go. All right. So here we go. So we've got the air quote good archetypes. The way that these things are seen as positive for people, the good archetypes, the hero, the innocent, the explorer, sage, the outlaw, magician, jester, lover, the everyman, caregiver, and the creator. So what Jung said was that every person has elements of this inside them, and all people have the potential to be these archetypes. But most of us, we pick one or two. And the reason we pick one or two is because most people react to their reactions. So they have a stable relationship with their shadow that doesn't change. Awareness doesn't change. The separation doesn't change. But it's not so unwieldy that it tears itself apart. It has enough potential to survive. Maybe even more than survive. But it doesn't have all of its potential consciously unlocked. So some people, if you've ever met somebody who just has incredible instinct, and they don't understand why they do what they do, but they do it, and they always seem to be right, you could ask them what their secret is, and they could give you the answer that Socrates gave, which was, I just listen to the little urge inside me that says I should do it. So that's one example of that. He has a passive connection with the shadow. It's just natural, based on the way they understand the world. Their language is one that communicates more readily than average. Oops. All right. This fucking thing, man. So if I'm looking at that, then let's pick one of these. I like the ruler as an example, because everybody talks about who should be in charge of what. And the answer is, I should be in charge of things when things are getting set up, and someone else needs to be in charge of it when they fail. That's the short answer of how people understand power, at least the way they act like they understand power. Oh, I could do a better job. I would just open this and do that, and great. That one tiny problem you were trying to fix is solved. And you created a famine and war, and people are dead. Why? Because half the people in the world thought you were stupid and were going to destroy their way of life. They took up arms against you and rose to stop you. But guess what? That one thing you thought was a good idea, it got done. And so what happens? Rulers, they focus around the issue of power and control. But let's talk about power and control for a second. We've already talked about power and control. It's neutral, it's potential. Things need control by definition to exist, at least in some form. They need control over their form if it's going to be the same thing from day to day. So when we talk about ruling, that comes with a lot of baggage. And before I can talk about ruling effectively, I need to address that baggage. Whatever you think of the president, whatever you think of Democrats or Republicans or the Green Party or the revolution or anarchists or atheists or theists, doesn't matter in this context. What matters is if you take a group of people and don't lead them, they kill each other. That is what matters. Number one. So that is why do we need rulers? If you don't think rulers are a good idea, there's a good chance your shadow is telling you if you were in charge, you would kill everyone. Because you can't understand power in a way that doesn't make that happen. That's the shadow speaking to you. If you can only see how it could turn out bad, you've met a limit of your imagination and not the limit of the potential of all 7 billion human beings combined, unless you're very special. And you've examined enough of those 7 billion human beings to make sure you got everybody's perspective on it. And then you have enough ways to measure a thing, at least to know if it's going to break down if you look at it from a certain perspective. Like I could think, man, if I could just get cheap gas, oh, that'd be wonderful. Well, maybe. A lot of drivers would think that's great. What about all the people who get money and get a living from pulling that resource out of the earth and refining it and sending it we can save the conversations of whether or not those people should be allowed to exist, because some people say they shouldn't. Fine. But in fact, let's go that route. Let's say that you're the ruler who cares about the planet and says, you know what, we're going green. We're going to get rid of oil. So you bite the bullet and disable a multi-billion-dollar industry. So now you've got factories, buildings, and production potential that has been crafted over decades, which is now useless. Maybe you could go back and redo it, but you're starting over. Fine, fair enough. The goal is to stop producing. So it would make sense that every single thing that is tied to the production of that thing would become worthless. Well, then your cars, they all got to get changed over. There's a lot of those, a lot of cars. There'd be no more gasoline. So no more generators that no more generators that run on gasoline. All the people that work in that industry, like I said, they would need different jobs, maybe from here and there. So the question isn't, should I end the oil industry? This is this crazy example, because good luck making that happen with all the dollars and guns that are behind keeping it around. Should I end the industry becomes, how can I end that industry without hurting anyone? That's the question a ruler asks. A tyrant, however, someone who doesn't understand power, someone who is responding to power from their shadow with an overly simplistic way of things, would say, well, let's just get rid of it. We'll figure it out. Maybe they'd even get a halfway decent plan in there, but they're not going to be the one to go in and care about every person who did that. Why? Because they detest those people, because they think the oil is killing the planet. Maybe it is. But the point is the perspective of the one who has the control. How much does that ruler care to use that control for others or for what they think is right? A very good ruler is able to make those things match up. A ruler who is better than a very good ruler is able to make those things match up and recognize when they are the one who is the problem. And they will use their authority to pull themselves out of the way. A tyrant would never do that. So if you want to think, if you want to do a test, let's say here. So I said the shadow never lies at the beginning of this lecture. Let's do a test, ruler or tyrant. How do you find out if somebody would be a good ruler? Well, very easy. Talk to them about control. Is control a negative thing, or is it a positive potential? Or is it only a positive thing? No potential for negative. Point is if you measure someone on the issue of control and they can only see a positive or a negative dimension without any sort of balance, they are a tyrant. They are not a ruler. So that's one way of understanding the shadow. So I said a good ruler, right? I said a good ruler. A good ruler thinks about how am I working for good and how am I being a tyrant? That is what a good ruler does. A ruler who is worse than that at least tries to use their powers for good, but they might not think that they're being a tyrant while they do it. So you're a ruler. What does that mean? You have to set limits and boundaries. You have to tell people no. You have to tell people how. They have to listen to you. If they don't, you need a way to handle that if you're a ruler. Oh man, that sounds like a totalitarian fascist regime. It does until somebody comes into your liquor store and you wish that somebody would stop them from shooting you. But if there's no system in place to handle that.
Machiavelli the Prince.
Yep, that's a good example. He does a great breakdown of the ruler archetype, and he does it politically, and he shows how to make it stable. He essentially builds a case for making a good ruler. What is my potential for good? How can I be perceived as hurting other people? And that's not to say that a good ruler doesn't hurt other people. Why would I say that? Because everybody's not good. Oh, that's a terrible thing to say. What do you mean everything's not good? I can point to one person who's not good. Maybe two if I looked hard enough. And everybody you talk to has a person they'll tell you they don't like. probably somebody in the news, somebody in the media. Half the time it will be the current president. So you have to realize that regardless of your potential as a leader, some people are going to be hurt by what you do because some people don't know how to react to their own reactions in ways that are healthy. The ruler is not the one who causes that problem. The ruler finds that problem when a person doesn't understand the potential of what's going on and they feel threatened. So a good ruler will hurt people because people hurt themselves when things happen. And a ruler who does nothing is not a ruler, he's a follower. So when I get to the shadow, so let's talk about all that. Let's say that I said a bunch of things about being a good ruler, and some of those things made a person react, but they don't understand why. That person, oh, a good ruler hurts people. What do you mean? No, a good ruler doesn't hurt anybody. Why do you think that? That would be the question then. If you can explain why, and it's not a self-referential argument to a morality that is outside of you, then you have your answer. If the answer is outside of you, you haven't reached the shadow. You've enabled its existence. Oh, that's because so-and-so said. That's because everybody knows you just shouldn't. Everybody knows that. This thing doesn't matter because why would it? That's the shadow talking. And that's why I like the shadow. The shadow doesn't lie. When the shadow doesn't like something, it can't say no. Can't say any differently. It's always got its heart on its sleeve, which is why learning how to talk to it is so useful. So let's pick a different one. The hero. I like the hero because everybody likes to be the hero of their own story. Most people have heard that phrase. I don't know how many people you can think of that wake up and say, I'm just going to go be evil today. And they don't mean it with pride. I'm just going to be evil. I'm going to do the wrong thing. No reason behind it. No, there's always a rationalization that makes the wrong thing the right choice. Most of the time, unless you're clinically insane and actually act randomly. Nobody thinks they're the bad guy. And those are all different ways of saying the same thing. So everybody likes to be the hero. Well, hero, according to Jung, was exploring the concept of hero exists on a spectrum. You have hero and villain. And Jung says that the spectrum of hero and villain is measuring the concept of mastery. Right? What's the hero? He's the guy that goes in when things are fucked up and he unfucks them because he's awesome. Who's the villain? The villain is the guy who goes in and fucks things up when they're fine because he's evil. Well, that's all well and good, but what about perspective? Say that, I use my oil example, right? If I go and displace 500,000 people worldwide and gut the infrastructure and melt it down to make solar panels, whatever. If I do that, I'm a hero to everybody who thinks it's about damn time. And I'm a villain to every person who loses their life or the stability they had in their life and they don't have enough time to get their shit together again, because that takes a long time in this world. I'm a villain to them. But what am I going to say? I'm going to say, I did the right thing. And all those people I hurt, I feel bad, but it had to be done. The lesser of two evils, what you're doing is, in the loosest possible way, acknowledging the fact that you might look like a bad person to some people if you believe this. But there's no ownership of it. Because with the lesser of two evils, that's the one time people do remember to compare their measurements to things. Is when it makes them look better. Oh, that's evil, but it's less evil. right? Well, guess what? You can put that scale wherever you want. If you have hero and villain, good and evil, anything less than 100% good contains a percentage of evil. That was the yin and the yang, right? That's not a new idea. That one's very old. Every person who has good in them also has bad in them. So to say the lesser of two evils, that's a nonsense statement, because you're not binding yourself to the spectrum of good and evil at that point. You're just saying it's less. Guess what? I'm the lesser of two evils compared to Mother Teresa. I'm the lesser of two evils compared to Mahatma Gandhi. Am I the lesser of two evils compared to Jeffrey Dahmer? Hope not. I don't think I am. I don't know. How many people have I made upset? I haven't eaten anybody. I never hurt anybody physically, but I pissed a lot of people off. How many people do you have to piss off before it equals one act of cannibalism? That's the nonsense that's being measured when people say the lesser of two evils. That is the shadow speaking. The concept of good and evil comes from the shadow. That is why Nietzsche wrote the book Beyond Good and Evil. Nietzsche also explores this topic. And I would recommend doing all of your shadow work before you read Nietzsche, because if you don't, his writings will make you want to kill yourself. Because with an unbalanced perspective that doesn't look at potential in all directions, Nietzsche's writings sound incredibly dark and hopeless. And he presents them that way. Why? Because he was a guy like me who presented positive things in a negative tone. And if the vibe is all that comes through because you can't understand the core concept and analyze it fully, that vibe's going to come through loud and clear. And his words are very good at making a person feel like there is no hope. So that's my recommendation for Nietzsche.
I want to read it now.
I think you've done enough work to read Will to Power. It was the last book he wrote, and it's got his most.
That's the one you sent me?
Yep. 2 books, 2 audiobooks, about 20 hours.
I started through a summary, but it being 20 hours, I'm going to put 1 or 2 hours into it before I decide to actually do it.
Yeah, do it. I would say.
So I've started a summary and we'll look at it and play with it. Then I'll decide.
I'll give you this. You know how most of the time I recommend when people are learning a new thing on YouTube, if you're able to speed it up. If you can listen faster than the person is talking, use the speed button. Don't do that with Nietzsche. You're not going to, his stuff is really dense. If anything, slow it down. Don't start at 1.5 because it's too dense.
We could always put in 15 minutes of it on Monday nights.
So that's just my recommendation to anybody who hasn't beyond that. If you're going to take him slow. You got to eat. That's an interesting, I'm going to say one. Nietzsche is like anal sex. You got to ease in. You can't just start at full power. Right? No, you're gonna do damage. There's gonna be tearing, there's gonna be blood, nobody's gonna be happy. Nobody will want to do it again. Take your time. You gotta romance Nietzsche.
That really hurts for the guy too.
So there you go. They can know what it feels like. So anyways, talking about Jung and the archetypes and beyond good and evil, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's where good and evil come from. Lesser of two evils, the scale, the spectrum, moving off of that.
Yeah. So the point is, the concept of hero and villain exists to fill in what we don't understand. Or a different way of saying that is, if I have 2 equally useful placeholders for unknown information, why wouldn't you pick the one that makes you feel better? That's natural. Most people do that without thinking. People pick the thing that feels better without thinking all the time. If you want to test that theory, try to make somebody feel worse by even a little bit. See what they do. Start small, because I guarantee you that's all you're going to need to get the reaction I'm talking about. Take 1 French fry from them without asking. That's how you can see that concept right there, front, loud and clear. You're a villain. They don't understand that that dude just crossed a boundary. They're not analyzing it like that. That dude did a bad thing. Well, if that's all you understand, he did a bad thing, what do you do to bad people? Well, you punish bad people. Okay. We can do that as long as I get to say who's good and bad. Because I'll never be on that list. I'll always get a pass, right? That's the way the inner mind works. So talking about the concept of hero and villain, it's really an exploration of the topic of mastery. How in control of the world are you, and what do you use that control for? So a hero and a villain can be types of rulers, competent rulers, right? Their example, hero and villain are measures of competence. They're measures of efficacy, efficiency, effectiveness. A hero is more effective than an average man by definition, because we define a hero as somebody who is above the average man and uses their power to help. A villain is defined as someone who is more powerful than the average man, and they lord that domination over everybody to make the world fit their image, the consequences be damned. So that's that thing that you run into where you see the heroic sacrifice, right? That's in all the movies. The hero, in so many ways, has to give up the thing that matters to him to finish the quest, because at some level we understand that within every villain is a hero and every hero is a villain. And that's why we're seeing a shift in Marvel movies to the sympathetic hero.
Does that have anything to do with the hero's journey?
Absolutely does. Absolutely does. So this is off topic, and I'll do I have a lecture on this in the future, but the very, very one sentence version of it is: consciousness understands. No, I have a better way of saying this. The hero's journey is the landmarks on the one-dimensional Mobius strip of an axiom. And we talked about that in a different lecture. The self-defeating nature of axioms. Ideas are one-dimensional constructs that loop in on themselves and create a boundary that you can explore inside. The hero's journey is the exploration of that entire boundary. It doesn't stop. It doesn't question the relevance. It doesn't ignore the part of it that doesn't make sense. It doesn't accept the inconsistency. So the hero leaves their comfort zone. They get a call to adventure. They go gather tools. They get supernatural aid. They make a journey to the underworld. They fight a battle. They recover some sort of thing. They have a giant confrontation. And then here's the thing that people ignore: the all is lost moment. That moment is when the Mobius strip turns and you are upside down. So your comfort zone is the part of the Mobius strip that you're used to. And you can go all the way around the Mobius strip one time and you'll only see the top of it. You have to go around the Mobius strip twice to experience both sides. That's just if you trace your finger on it. So that is the hero's, that is the all is lost moment. I have to actually completely upend everything I understand to meet this. And that's why the hero gathers all of those things along their journey. They use them in that moment to survive the trip. And then if they make it, then they can go down the other side of that Mobius strip. And guess what? It approaches normal again. Why? Because it's the same one-dimensional shape they've been traveling this entire time. They just got really scared when the whole world spun around. Well, that's ideas and axioms, so do with that what you will. Some people decide to cry about it or go insane. I think it's fun to think about them. Each their own, I suppose. But the hero's journey is a great example of that. So let me grab a different archetype here. We talked about the hero. This is another one you hear in the news a lot. And this is a conversation that you hear with both positive and negative consequence, and that's the innocent versus the victim. So according to Jung, that's a concept that explores the concept of safety.
Do you think you want me to finish my meeting and back when I come back with Michelle?
So if I am innocent, it's not my fault. Right? That's innocent. I am free of blame. That's a good thing. A lot of people enjoy being free of blame. Or you're a victim. Something bad happened to you and it wasn't your fault. Now, maybe the good things that happen to you are because you did bad things to other people and you're not innocent so much as you are a tyrant. Or maybe bad things happen to you because curse you the consequences of my own actions. You're not a victim then. You're the architect of your own demise. Or maybe you just got unlucky. There's examples of this in every direction. I'm only mapping the ones people ignore. Or the ones that people talk about when they want to insult somebody, but nobody pays attention to. Stop acting like such a victim. That's what you hear. Well, what does that mean? At its core, the message behind stop acting like such a victim is take some responsibility for the problem that bothers you, whether you think you deserve it or not, because nobody else cares about your problem. And you're telling me to care about your problem when you won't do anything about it. So that person then, to protect their victimhood, becomes a tyrant and says, you need to do this. That's one perspective of that, right? It could be right or wrong, justified or unjustified, but logically, a person who is a victim that blames somebody else wants that person to pick it up. They want to be the ruler of the person that is making them a victim. And that's a tricky concept because victims make bad rulers. Victims make terrible rulers because they only care about who hurt them. And they care about them so much that often there is some sort of uppance to be had. Some sort of penance that needs to be paid before everything is okay. Some checklist of things and browbeating and emotional validation that will remove their sense of victimhood before they're allowed to not feel like a victim before. And so if that is not provided to them and they think they need it, and they go out and say, you need to give this to me. Why? Because it's fair. Why? Because it's not fair that this happens. So that's that whole circle where people don't get to the question of why. They fall into these archetypes because that's a wrong thing to do. You're a villain if you do that. Well, now you've just made a whole hero's journey. So if you want to make a hero's journey out of it, you can't ignore the other parts. You need a call to adventure. You need to leave your comfort zone. You need supernatural aid. You need to level up. You need to go do a thing. You need to fight a bad guy. You need to overcome adversity. You need to win. You need to be brave, and you need to get back to normal. That's what happens if you put people in the roles of hero or villain or victim or innocent, and you want to do something about it. A story needs to happen. Stories are change. Stories are how we process change. Stories are how we expand our intellectual boundaries because we map the boundaries through the story circle. That's how it works. That's why the story circle is interesting. Things that can teach us something very useful are interesting. Why do you think people don't get tired of stories? How many stories can you hear before you don't want to hear another story ever? We don't get sick of that usually. We might change the type of story we want to listen to, right? I'm in the mood for this kind of story, but you never turn that off. Not really. The narrative changes. And that's what Jung was saying with his archetypes. These are the stories that people tell. The story of victim and innocent, the story of hero and villain, the story of ruler and tyrant. And so now to circle this back, I wish I could talk more about this and go through more of these archetypes, but I really need to tie the core idea together, which is how do I make this useful in my life? Go ahead.
We went through the archetypes in the Heyoka group.
Yeah.
All 12 of them. It might have been a 12-week series actually. And I'd be down to go through the inner ones for the shadow in another 12 weeks too, like going around.
Yeah, we could maybe do another, if this series goes well, maybe we can do a appendix something where we do more in-depth shadow stuff, I'd be fine with that. So let me talk about, there's a specific reason that I talked about ruler, tyrant, hero, villain, innocent, and victim. And some of you are probably connecting the dots in your mind as to what that pattern matches in the real world today. Victims and tyrants. I'm going to make a statement that nobody will agree with except me. We could end racism tomorrow if we all decided to. So if you're disagreeing with me right now, I've got you right where I want you. But for that to happen, that would have to be the most important thing. But it's not. Because the roles are still there. The ruler and the tyrant. No, that person's responsible. We can't fix racism until. We can't do this until. I can't forgive what happened until. Guess what all of those things have in common? They're in front of the thing that we want to happen, and we are saying we will not choose that until this, which means people are acting in a way that is showing the goal that is more important to them, which is understanding the part of themselves that is hurting them because they don't see it. Their shadow won't let them end racism because they don't understand how. That's the example. They don't understand the relationship between ruler and tyrant. They don't understand the relationship between hero and villain. They don't understand the role of victim and innocent. And then putting those things together in the larger context, how to translate those into a stable system that won't break. So if nobody agreed with that, great. So moving on to how to make the shadow useful in your life. This is the part that I like. So all that stuff that I said in previous lectures about identifying unknown unknowns, identifying the boundary of ideas, mapping limitations, taking measurements, understanding where ideas come from, how people interact, how our brain waves meet each other and influence us by the interaction. We can either measure that or experience it, or both. When all of those things are practiced and you're aware of them, then you can start to talk to the shadow because you understand enough about how measurement and information behaves mathematically that you don't break the rules that make it go. So everybody is free to use these tools of language and measurement however they want. Nobody is free from the laws of cause and effect. So if you use the way to measure things in a way that doesn't work, you're going to get nonsense result. Now that's a bit of an abstract concept. So I'm going to take that same idea and use a more readily accessible answer. It is no different than understanding the mathematics behind general relativity. It is no different than understanding how to write a computer program. And I like the computer program analogy the best because there are multiple languages of computer code, and all of them can do similar things. And all of them do similar things in different ways. Some languages are better at certain programming tasks. The tools that are relevant to that computer programming language specifically measure a certain dimension in an elegant way, which is incompatible with other kinds of measurements. Why? Because if it didn't measure this thing in an elegant way, it would be something else that does something else. This is the thing that does the thing. If it did a different thing, it would be a different thing. That's the point of computer programming. the language has a function. And if the language is put together in a nonsense way, it gives you nonsense. And we have a term for that: garbage in, garbage out. And it would make sense that such a thing would apply to any kind of measurement. And if we go back to my core definition of consciousness back at the beginning, episode 1, consciousness at its heart is a thing that compares. That is one way to define consciousness that is not inconsistent with the way consciousness behaves. It does other things. It can do many things. But that's always true about consciousness. It compares. It has to, because that's how information works. Because things are waves and everything is a superposition. So you have to compare because you have a before and after. And sometimes the before is the before, and sometimes the before is the same as the after, but the middle is very different because of the interaction. That's how wave addition works. Two waves will travel at each other. The same wave enters, the same wave leaves. From the opposite direction, the same wave enters, the same wave leaves. But while they are together, they do crazy things depending on what the waves are. There's cancellation, there's addition, et cetera, which we covered in a different episode. So that's kind of the core underneath all of this, is to understand how those measurements are relevant, and that if they're treated that way all the time, you can start to get useful information out of the shadow. So let's give you some examples now, because that was a lot of theory, and I wish I had more time to spend on that, but I don't have enough to fill 2 episodes, so you're stuck with this. Say that I talk to somebody about, it's a good one, spanking your kids. There you go. That's a thing people get riled up over. Say I talk to a person about spanking their kids. And I say, you know what? I got spanked as a kid. I turned out fine. And that person, without even asking me, they don't ask me about my childhood. They don't ask me about my experience. They don't ask me why I think the thing I do. They don't ask. Their first response is, well, that's never true. That's always bad. You're not talking to that person anymore. You're talking to their shadow. Why? Why do you know you're talking to their shadow? Because they had a reaction they don't seem to be aware of. And you can test that. A good person who talks to someone else's shadow doesn't take the first measurement they get. And that's because information takes a minimum of 3 points to be stable. So you take 3 different measurements of the same thing, it's a pretty good chance that you've got some idea of what it is. You take 1 measurement, you're guessing. Maybe you're a really good guesser. Or maybe you've talked to that person so much that you have points that you trust that you can combine with this single new one. That's fair enough. I've known that person for 20 years. I know how they think. You hear that all the time. You do a thing and it ends poorly. You might instantly know how your wife is going to react. Had some experience with her reactions enough to know that. So you only need 1 point to know it's going to end poorly. But you get a reaction that can't be explained beyond the concept of good and evil, right or wrong. You're talking to somebody's shadow. So, great. You've made contact, but what do you do with that? Now, I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but you start mapping. Okay, so if that person thinks spanking your kids is bad, and they really can't answer me in one response about why that's bad. They might say, well, spanking is bad because it hurts the child and it does irreparable harm. So now you're talking to this person's shadow. So you have to realize they're not aware of the opposite potential of whatever it is they're reacting to. They're in a reaction in that moment. So you have to know what you're dealing with. You're not dealing with a rational, conscious entity when you deal with the shadow. You're dealing with somebody's survival systems because that is how the shadow communicates. So that can be a misleading thing because most people want to ascribe a positive or a negative, want to ascribe a negative connotation to survival systems. They think fight, flight, fear, and anger and rage. No, any reaction, curiosity, hunger, interest. Every one of those archetypes has the potential to be a part of that explanation. So what would I do? Well, it's not good for me to just say, well, let's say that I don't know my own shadow as well. And I say, well, you're just wrong because I'm living proof that you're not going to get screwed up. Unless you're saying I'm screwed up. Are you some kind of moron? Can't you see that I'm right here in front of you and that I'm a perfectly well-adjusted, albeit intense individual who might sound a little bit angry all the time, but wouldn't hurt a fly because I regularly pick up bugs from the house and take them outside because I'd rather them die a natural, dignified, nature-related death than to have them, I don't know, be in my house, trapped away from everything they know and they're used to, except that it's warm. And who knows, maybe I'm the villain for that. Maybe they wanted to be here. But if I am trapped inside a reaction to my own reactions, and I meet somebody who is trapped in a reaction to my own reactions, and those reactions point in opposite directions, well, now we go all the way back to cognitive physics, and you have the conservation of cognitive dissonance, where you'll just ram into each other and get madder and madder until one of you gives up. Then it becomes a battle of ego. It doesn't matter who's right anymore, who has the better idea. Who is the loudest? Who is the most stable when someone else shakes them up? That's what that turns into. And it doesn't end well. Why? Because people who are trapped inside that dynamic are also trapped inside the roles of hero and villain. So what happens? Even if they lose, the bad guy won. What do you do when the bad guy wins? Does the movie end? No, that's when the movie's just getting going. But for the villain, who's the hero of their story, now, story's over. Took care of that guy pretty good. Showed him he's not coming back. And then it begins this cycle of, no, you're the bad guy. 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 My side, your side, my side, your side. Nothing. It's a circle. And the most ironic part is that it's two halves of the same circle. And if those people would put their damn circles together and pull the positive parts out and combine them, then they would have the full circle, and neither one of them would be trapped inside that reaction anymore. So again, that's how you recognize the influence of the shadow, is when a person is trapped in a loop. They can't do anything different than what they're doing right now. They just have feelings to respond to. Maybe those feelings are good, but we've already talked about the difference between right and effective. So nothing about being right in the moment from a single perspective that is yours is useful to help a person who is wrong from your perspective change their mind. And the more the person insists on being right, the more they reinforce the hero villain, et cetera, the worse they make their problem. So if you think you're right, let's give you the maximum benefit of the doubt and say that you are, and you're only being stupid by acting like saying that you're right will make your thing happen. That's as generous as I can be in that circumstance. You're only stupid at one thing, which is recognizing a pattern of self-created defeat. Your cause results in that effect. But it's the right thing to do. Well, now you're just trapped because you don't see a different thing that could be better than what you think is right. That's how the shadow works. So let's talk about what it means to talk to your own shadow. It's kind of how you see it in other people, but I can tell you this. The most effective type of communication with the shadow is going to be with your own, because you don't have to guess. You know, and you can't lie to yourself about how you feel. That's why the shadow uses your feelings, because it doesn't lie to you. It can give you bad advice, or it can give you stimulus that you think means to do a certain thing, but it's doing the best it can to help for what you don't see. So I'm just going to go very quickly around these 12 archetypes and tell you how to recognize them in yourself. So if you're the ruler, if you think that you would be better off in charge, all right, here's how you handle that. And this is going to be a broken record. How can things go perfectly? How can things go terribly wrong? How much do you care about the things that could go terribly wrong? Next thing, hero or villain. I want to do a thing to change what's going on. Great. How good could it go? How bad could it go? How much do you pay attention to how bad it's gone? That's a better one. You've got your memories to use too, if you want. Forget about the moment. Take a look back. Play the replay of your life's greatest hits. Every time you've been in charge, how's it turned out? Was it a shit show? People get mad? Did everybody get along? I don't know, I wasn't there. If you were with me, you probably laughed, were a little confused, hopefully had a good time, and we did more than we started with, but probably not a lot more. But you ask yourself, how did it go bad? And if a thing went bad when you were the ruler, you were not a wise ruler because you were in charge. And that is the part of yourself that becomes the part of yourself that doesn't care why things went bad when you were in charge is the tyrant. Not my problem. They had it coming. Too bad. You got to break it. You got to break some eggs to make an omelet. The hero. How many times did you try to help and you made things worse? You're the villain. Get over yourself. That's what I had to do. Or don't. Say that it's everyone else's fault. I don't care. I'm not you. We're all going to die someday. Some of us are going to feel like they were right till they died. It might as well be you if that's you. I can look back and see a bunch of times where I tried to help and I made things worse. There's times I tried to help myself and it turned out worse. Well, guess what? Then I was a victim. So victim, innocent. How many times did something bad happen to you and it wasn't your fault at all? How many times did something happen and, oh, just if everybody else would do this one thing, or if nobody would do this anymore, or if we could just get everybody to do blank. Well, you're a victim. You're not an innocent in that sense, because innocents can do something. Victims are victims. They're powerless. So when did you try to do something and you were powerless against, or when did something happen to you and you were powerless? That's when you were a victim. When did something happen and it was innocent? You know, you can go all day with that, but I got to keep moving. Explorer and Raider, that's a fun one. Those are the same person, depending on who you are. Raiders of the Lost Ark, there's a good one. Indiana Jones, brave American archaeologist, goes in and steals somebody's ancient artifact. And then what is that? What happens? It ends up in a box, in a building, because of Indiana Jones. He could have left it there. He was a raider. He just wanted to explore. It belongs in a museum, says Harrison Ford. Maybe it belongs with the people who had it. Maybe. Now, if all of those people get together and say, we would like to make this donation, which represents our heritage, here you go, that's a lot different than beating a bunch of booby traps. That's heroic. No, he is an expert villain at defeating things designed to protect cultural treasures, from some perspectives. The elitist and the sage. When do you know and when do you think you know? That one, you see that one a lot with people who are very intelligent and not very emotionally connected. Because they play the relevance card all fucking day. Oh, that's a feeling, it doesn't matter. Okay, it doesn't matter, fuck you, how do you feel? Guess what, however you feel doesn't matter. That's what that argument turns into. But guess what? You use that argument, all of a sudden, now they're not the sage. They become this wounded, vulnerable thing, which is like, how dare you? I went to college and I know this, and you're so stupid, and I'm better because of this and this and this and this. And all of that is just them making themselves the hero, when really they need to say they're better than everybody else here because they know how woefully deficient they are in the realm of emotion. So what do? They make it irrelevant. And when you make things irrelevant, You aren't a sage. That's knowledge, by the way, the elitist and the sage. The elitist is the part of you that doesn't care to understand. And that works very well with the hero who says, I shouldn't have to because only bad guys understand that. These things work together quite a bit. The criminal and the outlaw. Well, one of them's doing the right thing and one of them's just being a dick. Let's go make our point and light a bunch of buildings on fire. Outlaws or criminals? Freedom fighters or terrorists? The answer is both. Anyone who says it's one or the other is playing the hero villain archetype. It's both. There are criminals who show up just for the glass breaking. There are thugs and elitists and vulnerable people who show up just to break shit. Why? Because there's an opportunity. And there's good people who show up because they want to make a difference. Why? Because there's an opportunity. There's a potential. Humans do the rest. A trickster and the magician. That one's power. Subtlety? I don't know. That the trickster and the magician, I'm going to admit, I don't have a good concept of that right now that I can put into words. More or less, that is the ability to use, the magician I know a little bit. It's the ability to use what you have effectively and in great ways. It's the ability to focus your power. So when you use your power to accomplish great things, great. When you use your power to deceive, you're a trickster. I can't go deeper than that one. I need to do more work on that myself. I'm going to save the jester for last because that's my favorite one because that's who I am. Creator and destroyer. So the innovation. Anybody who doesn't think creation and destruction are the same thing doesn't understand the way time works. You can imagine time moving forward and backwards. Anything that can be created can be destroyed the same way. Things that are created are specific. So if you create a thing to replace another thing, you are a destroyer of the old thing. But people don't like to be destroyers, some of them. Or some people don't like to be creators, or whatever, it doesn't matter. That's the way that creation and destruction are the same thing. But you might reject the part of yourself that wants to break shit. Why? Because it looks socially, it's an expression of impotence, really. You've lost control of your reaction to your reactions. What do? I don't know, I'm just so mad I need to let it out. So what do? You break shit. What is that? That is a moment of powerlessness, a powerlessness to the self. You are not in control of yourself anymore. You're in control of your reaction. That's the destroyer. The lack of self-control that gets rewritten as, I had to do that. That was the right thing to do. I don't care if it was incredible violence. Maybe you're right. Maybe an act of incredible violence was what was needed. Is that likely when it's a mom and pop store that, I don't know, some people work very hard to build and now all their stuff is gone and hopefully insurance will take care of it? I don't know. Don't know. Is it when somebody blows up an abortion clinic with a bunch of doctors in it? Are those people heroes or are they destroyers? Are they tyrants, villains? They're not going to see it that way is my only point. All right, moving down the line. This one's going to be a loaded one because, not because of anything I say, but because of what other people have said about these words and have decided is true. So if I say the word slave and you stop listening because you're remembering everything that word means, you've got some shadow work to do there. If you've got guilt for a thing you didn't do, you need to figure out why and what you can do about it and what's appropriate. But the slave caregiver is centered around service. What's the difference there? The difference is whether or not you agree to do it. If I work for somebody because I agree to, I'm a caregiver. If I work for somebody because I don't have a choice, I'm a slave. People want to see themselves as free. So what are they going to do? They're not going to look at themselves as slaves unless that's really a different word and a euphemism for hero, underdog. I'm not out of control. No. I don't have, I'm not powerless. No, 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 I'm just momentarily powerless because that villain needs to be destroyed. Two very different perspectives. One seeks an answer from others. One seeks the answer from within. But both slave and caregiver are two coins of the self and the shadow. It's a spectrum. Everybody lands on it differently. Here we go. The everyman and the follower. That's the belonging right there. That's the spectrum of how well do I fit in. That's tribalism. Strength in numbers, right? Apes strong together. You know, everybody gets that. So am I the everyman, the person who embodies the core collective good, right? I'm just the average Joe, salt of the earth, don't want to hurt anybody, want to lead a good life, want to do the right thing. Great. How much of that is you just doing things because other people tell you it's good? Or because you think it's what the right thing to do is? I'll tell you, a high percentage of us are followers. Every person is a follower in some dimension of their life without realizing it. Some of us are followers and we follow things that are good for us without knowing why. We might not know why it's a good idea to, something stupid, drink 5 glasses of water a day. We might not think we might not understand why that's a good idea. But if we do it, we get the benefit. And we talked about that with social memory, right? That was a different lecture. How things become part of the social structure and they get passed around here and there, et cetera. And we benefit from them without our direct knowledge. We forget they're relevant because they were never irrelevant to us. How much of us is just being the right person and how much of us is just going along because it hurts to be outside of the validation and approval of everyone else? You're going to be blind to the part of you that is just trying to not be singled out. That's the shadow side of that. The lover and the seducer. Are you loving for yourself to make others better? Or are you loving for selfish reasons, the consequences be damned? Did I use my ability to connect with someone intimately for personal gain? Do I have to tell a story about why that was necessary? Am I a seducer or a lover? Do I hurt or do I help? And then finally, the jester versus the hater. All right. I can tell you from personal experience, the jester hates things. I'll tell you what the jester hates. The jester hates inconsistency. The jester hates contradiction. The jester hates anything that doesn't feel good. Pleasure is what's being measured there. How much of a joker are you? Why? Are you joking because something's funny? Are you joking because you don't understand it? Are you joking because it feels nicer than hating it? Can you admit to yourself where the hatred comes from and why you think it's necessary to express it? A good jester. I can talk about a good jester because I spent some time trying to be one. I'll give you my goals and not necessarily my achievements. A good jester is somebody who can say something about a thing that people hate in a way that makes them feel better about hating it. Or a good jester can show a person how they're hating themselves without realizing it and make them feel better about it. Bad jester, life is a joke. You may as well kill yourself. Nothing we do matters. It's all nihilism, all the way down. We can't know anything for sure. That's a bad jester. Life is a joke and it's not funny. So, to summarize, since we got 1 minute left, anything you react to is a hello from your shadow. The easiest things to find are the things that you react strongly to in a negative way, because you don't want those things to continue. Most people don't like to experience negative feelings. There's a word for that, it's neuroticism. and how bad it is in some of you. There's a number for that. We've gone so far about how we don't like this that we've studied it and given it a scale all on our own, which is the thing that I say we need to do for everything. We did that for how much we hate feeling bad. Humans can do that if they don't like something enough. Strong motivator. You have a reaction that you don't like. First step is to ask, why don't you like it? And if you really want to make that question pointed, ask how that question makes you feel vulnerable. And then if you can get through that process, well, good, that's the hard part. Until the next part, which is a little harder. Now, you have to look at all of the reactions that you have that you label as positive and ask why. Because as easy it is to find self-destructive behavior inside of vices. We're good at that because it's easy to say vices are bad. That's why you're allowed to say things are bad. And you're allowed to say any bad thing you want about things that are bad. So it would make sense that the vices would be the easiest to tackle. A little harder to do when you're looking at something that's good. You don't want to pick away at something that's good. Oh, no, we're not going to talk about that. That's above reproach. We're not going to question why I'm such a nice guy. If I don't question why I'm a nice guy to everybody, I'm never going to figure out that I'm responding to how terribly I was treated when I was younger. And hey, you know what? Many people stop there. Great, at least you have a link. But if you don't stop there and you say, well, why do I react that way to that? Well, then you can get to the real stuff that you can control. The stuff that other people didn't do to you, the stuff that you reacted to, the stuff you choose to maintain a singular perspective on without expansion or the opportunity for expansion. I felt weak and powerless. I felt like I couldn't do anything. I felt like I didn't matter. I didn't learn how to want things. I didn't matter to my mother. And if you can be honest with yourself about a thing like that, now you can see the very real link between your choices and your reactions to things, and link it to you and choices and perspectives that you can control. Because guess what? Nothing that you know goes away when you learn a new thing. You only add. And if you learn a thing that makes you realize you were wrong, that's a good thing. So to close, you can do a lot by assuming that you're running away from things you don't like to see in yourself. And the more comfortable you get with that language, the less it will hurt, the less it will be a shock. The more you'll sort those things out over time, the more you'll make a map of what your feelings really mean. And then when that map is complete, a nice little side effect is you can see elements of that map in other people because they will use the same landmarks of what is good, what is evil, we're a hero, we're a creator, who's a lover, who's a seducer. The context in which they place everything has been mapped inside you through feeling and outside of you through mathematical relationship knowledge. And then you have everything you need to recreate their experience inside you because you know the rules. So that's why you can learn a lot by talking to someone's shadow. They won't lie, and they will tell you what they mean without thinking. So the end. Any questions or comments?
Definitely gonna dig more into it. I'm adding it to the Monday list, and we can definitely go back and appendix it like you suggested too.
Okay. Duncan?
Yeah, it's very interesting, actually. Got a lot of good points. I'm still not really sure how I want to absorb it, how it absorbs into me right now.
Okay, so what's your reaction to we'll do some shadow work with you right here. What's your reaction to the information, positive or negative?
It's all positive.
I gotta go. Guys.
All right. See you later, Tony. All right, so
Okay.
why is it positive?
Well, because it's a building block. You know, it helps people to understand more of their own character that
So
they
if
don't.
I'm doing shadow work based on what you just said,
Right,
you've made a measurement and a declaration. Number one, you've assigned value to building blocks, which is small pieces that make bigger things. Number two, you've assigned value to helping people. You've assigned value to things that make sense, which means if I'm using the shadow language, you have difficulties with finding relevant building blocks and finding out how to make them make sense. Because that's the opposite of what you told me by what you said was important. If you say that's important, you are measuring it against blank. And therefore I have a frame of reference because you've said positive or negative. You created an unbounded measurement that was only good or bad. And it was very subtle, but it was there. And you know what? Fine, we all do this and we have to. But anything that is said that is unbounded or unstipulated becomes half of a spectrum. So you can infer the other half so long as the person communicating it seems to be oblivious to that other half. And it's always subtle. That's one explanation of that.
yeah, and with part of that, what you were just saying is also, like I say, in my behalf anyway, is I look at it in a neutral stance. You know, and there's a far right and a far left. And what is acceptable to me?
So what does it need
That's
to be
when I
neutral?
start going for that. But I like to use the aspect, like you said, helping others to understand and be able to see how they can also determine how to neutralize instead of being on one end or the other.
So let me give you another example of how a virtue can also hide information the shadow has. You said it's good to be neutral. Why?
You know, you're not on either side of the fence, kind
What
of.
happens if you're on one side of the fence versus the other that's bad?
Well, no matter which side of the fence you're on, you think it's good. And the opposite side is always the bad.
So what does
Regardless,
that do to a person if they have that perspective?
well, it blinds them.
So you would say it's bad to be blind to information.
Yeah, in certain ways, most definitely.
Okay, so now we've gotten a why. It's not a why that ties to the core. So if I was doing shadow work, I would say, why is it bad to be blind to information? Now we're starting to get to the uncomfortable questions that people
But there-
normally avoid.
right. Yeah, but
Why
there
is
is,
it bad to be blind to information?
you know, there I'd say, you know, because information is knowledge. You know, and you can't make a knowledgeable decision without knowledge.
So let's say somebody doesn't need to make knowledgeable decisions to be happy. You can imagine such an
Yeah,
individual,
you
right?
do that. You can make your own happiness without anything like that.
So
you know-
how are you measuring the value of knowledge? You're putting an importance on knowledge, which means that there is an internal disgust towards your internal stupidity.
And
That's
there's,
the part of- that's
there's
the part of yourself that you would be blind to by the logic, not by accusation. I'm just using a
Right.
math formula to extrapolate.
Which
can
you also-
verify or deny.
right. And at the
So-
same time, you know, because I know a lot of people that have a lot of knowledge, but it's still dumber than a brick.
The
And that's
end
the
of
case
that,
of my case would be wisdom.
yeah. So most of let me say if let me give you an example. This is a test. Okay, I'm testing a math extrapolation. Are you uncomfortable when you have to talk about how you're weak?
Not really, not personally.
Okay. Okay, good. Why?
Well, because I know I have weaknesses, and there's a lot of weaknesses that I have that can also be used as a strength.
Okay, so let's measure that differently. How much do you think about how you're stupid?
Oh, way too much, because that's the way I was brought up.
So if you were brought up feeling stupid, you would put an exaggerated importance on intelligence because that's the thing that you missed the most.
Which is probably why I just continued to go to school and go to school and go to school and go to school to.
Because that made you
intelligence.
feel not stupid.
Right,
So now we've gone to, so if I'm doing the shadow chain here, again, this is, you can go in each of these directions as wide as you want, but if you go from point A to point B, it's good to have all of the information that's possible, because I felt stupid when I was a kid.
Well, it's kind of hard not to when you got a dad that constantly tells you you're stupid.
And then that's an aversion to weakness, right? Hero, villain.
Right, exactly.
My dad was the villain, I'm the victim. Here's how and why and why and why. Well, then you get to the more uncomfortable questions that a therapist should be asking, which is, are you still feeling that way now, even though your dad might have been dead for however long?
Yeah, well, actually, he has been dead for a few years now.
So the question is, why does that behavior linger when that person is gone?
Well, to me, I consider
That's a
it,
therapist question. And that deals with vulnerability on a scale that I'm not comfortable addressing with most people, because
Yeah.
it's the fear of appearing weak is a coping mechanism that's very difficult to overcome. But
and
I can
most,
tell you, anytime you explain why something bad happened and it wasn't your fault, there's a fear of weakness under there. It's a survival thing.
yeah, that's true. But in my personal aspect, I don't see it as a fault,
And you
but as
would,
a cause.
that's the shadow part
Not
of
my
it.
fault.
Right.
Well, it's my fault if I allow it to be not my fault.
I'd say fault is a thing that people measure when they're trapped in the concept of good and evil.
That's a good way of putting it. Very well.
What's your potential is a better question.
Yeah.
And if your potential is it's not my fault, therefore it's not my responsibility, which is where people end up when they get trapped in the confines of good and evil, you don't move, or you go in circles. But that's two examples of shadow work, and how you can do it. And I'll have a recording of this it's very difficult to observe while you're in it. But if you were to take this little clip here and transcribe it, write it down, then you could go back and use the points that I specifically referenced and make like a little grid. And then I guarantee you your triangulation ability would make quick work of that. And you'd be able to apply it to many other things you already know, to the level that you can understand it further than you already do.
Yeah. And in a sense, what you're saying with the concept of failure, did I fail because of, well, is it my fault or is it somebody else's fault? Or, like myself, I like to say, well, I failed at this, but it's no one's fault. It is what it is. And the next time I come into this picture, I may have a different outlook as to how I'm going to address it and hopefully not fail.
Yep.
And to
The
me,
words
failure
of,
is success.
In the words of the infamous Eric Cartman, what does the scoreboard say?
Yeah, that's true. And that all depends on how you keep score and who's keeping score.
When you talk about failure, that's one way to measure it. What does the scoreboard say?
Yeah. And if you notice as to success, that's why I think failure is the key to success, because even Edison would sit there and he made it as a quote, and it's pretty popular quote now. It's where he said, if it were not for my failures, I would have never succeeded. And
If
he
you don't
tried to light
understand
the
how
light
to
bulb
avoid failure,
1,000 times.
yeah. If you don't understand failure well enough to know how to avoid it, you'll never have success. And if failure never is your fault, then success will never be your fault either.
Yeah, right.
You'll lead a mediocre life, and you'll have a lot of very good reasons when you die about how you did the best you could. And hopefully you're not fixating on the many things you could have done to take advantage of your potential, because that's not the thing to think about on your deathbed. That's the thing to think about when you think you've still got time to do something about it.
Yeah, I
When you're
agree.
ready to check out, that's time to play the greatest hits, because you're not going to have much else to go, because you're going to leave all that behind and go on to something else. So if you're going to have one moment left on Earth, and before you leave Earth behind to whatever's after that, you may as well go out with the parts of it you enjoyed rather than the parts of it you wish you'd done like everyone else does.
No doubt.
So anyways, thanks, Duncan. Hopefully that question Q&A helped.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I hope somebody, if nothing else.
We'll do another one next week.
Sure.
All right, take it easy.
Okay, you too, Tom. Thanks.